Hello, today's Bible study comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, and reads as follows. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands him. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Well, we start off, and Paul is still telling the Corinthians, pursue love, and you notice this is first, and desire spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. So when he says pursue love, Paul is saying by pursuing by going forth for the real reason of love for Christians. And since we know what love is, because he told us in the last chapter at the end in verse 13 that love is the greatest. It is the way of the Lord. It's an attribute of God. So we have to pursue this. We have to seek it out. We have to search it. And he says that's first. And that goes back to him making how important love is compared to everything else in chapter 13. And then he says, desire spiritual gifts. Um, and what he was saying here is, look, Corinthians, there's nothing wrong with you desiring these gifts, but, and there's that but, when you do it, it should be out of love. It's not to be able to be seen and to be known for it and all that. It's out of love. And the gift that he tells them to truly go for, he says, especially that you may prophesy. And Paul spoke of this already. If you remember, we were talking back a while back. But now he is specifically talking about prophecy and tongues. And he's giving you the direction on how they're supposed to work. Um, and at this time in the Corinthians place of worship, they were going crazy over tongues and they weren't concentrating on prophecy. And as you notice, Paul said prophecy first. He says that you may prophesy. And when you think of him prophesying, you have to think true prophesying, not inspired preaching and what we may think it is. Paul is telling you that this prophecy is about much more than that. And he's saying, hey, preaching and prophecy are not the same. And Paul was letting them know this. Preaching, as we said, was teaching. We even brought this up in the last chapter a day or two ago. But prophecy was about predictions from inspired men, women they received, and the revelation of it. So then Paul goes into verse 2 and he says, for he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men but to God, for no one understands him. However, in the Spirit he speaks mysteries, but he who prophesies speaks edification and exhortation and comfort to men. Now that's big. So he starts off, he says, he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men but to God. So with this gift, he's saying the speaker addresses God, not men. And this is a big mishap because They believe tongues is a supernatural way for communication, for man to man instead of man to God. But if you look back, and I say this all the time, back to Acts chapter 2, the the apostles spoke and preached the word in the tongues of the day in that day. Remember that. And they were speaking to a whole bunch of tribes. So instead, people say they spoke to God, and the multinational crowd overheard their praise to God. And what they were saying, if you go to verse 2 and 11, it says, "We hear them speaking in our own tongues, the wonderful works of God." So when you look at this and when you understand what really happens, you don't need a person to interpret a tongue. A true interpretation of the gift of tongues is addressed by God, not by man. This is from God to man. And we don't want you to, even myself, learning as I go, we can be led to believe that the gift of tongues is just the ability to speak another language. And Paul is just telling you right here, um, when you interpret the sermon from a preacher, that's usually in your native tongue. So no one needs to interpret the preacher's sermon for God's sake. You don't need to. You can understand it. So make sure if you think in the gift of tongue, it shouldn't draw unnecessary attention to ourselves. And God doesn't give it out for the gift of others. Though others benefit from it, it's for that believer in God alone. So he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men but to God. And in this statement, I guess you could say that it is not, the gift of tongues is not just a language spoken for human benefit. It is not. And I do think Paul speaks sarcastically here, but and he's going after the Corinthians here, and it's because they're trying to go speak to God instead of men. And Paul is telling them, why don't you just speak to man? Because for no one understands him. Paul is saying nobody understands you normally. And when someone spoke in tongues, no one else could understand them. So the intention is to speak to God and not to man. And if that is the case, it is fine if no one understands them because God understands them. But God understands all because he created all. So the gift of tongue still speaks to man. So in the spirit, he speaks mysteries. And in this part, and I go back and forth with this many times and many days. It does not mean it isn't really a language. Okay, it's in the spirit, or they're speaking gibberish. But they do speak mysteries because it's in the spirit, and we don't know what they're saying. I I see the Lord saying, prophesy to man, as he says, but he who prophesies speaks to men. So Paul is saying, now what you see the gift of tongue can do, supposed to do, but the gift of prophecy, that's what you should be striving for, because that's directed towards men. It's God speaking through people to people, which we need. But he who prophesies speaks edification and exhortation and comfort to men. Not only is this gift for men and directed at us, it is supposed to help us, enhance us. It's supposed to be positive. The edification will build us up. The exhortation is going to encourage you and help you. And then you need comfort because we struggle. We need people to console us. We need these things. And it's not just saying we going to be there with you, it's actually adding comfort to them. Amen.